Good afternoon. How did the British colonial legal regime indirectly impact Jewish law? By indirect impact, I seek to focus on how amorphous factors such as ethos, atmosphere, and culture may have influenced religious law. Thus, today I will not consider cases where the British legal regime imposed legal institutions and therefore had a direct impact on colonial religious law. Rather, I will highlight how colonial legal culture penetrated local legal enclaves. To this end, I'll look at a frontier that has yet to be described, how British colonial legal structures left footprints on Jewish law. Specifically, I focus on the issue of forum. I'm interested in the flip side of the common law doctrine, forum non-convenience. What was the appropriate forum for adjudicating questions of Jewish law or for appealing decisions in British colonies? Today, I will present two cases from different colonies, one from Rangoon, Burma, and the other from Melbourne, Australia. I begin by turning to Burma. There is an evidence of a Jewish presence in Burma dating back to the mid-18th century, but it was only in the 19th century that enough Jews reached Burma to form a community. Following the Anglo-Burmese Wars, Burma was annexed as a province of British India. The oldest Indian Jewish community was the B'nai Israel. While retaining certain Jewish customs, the B'nai Israel had assimilated much of the surrounding culture. They spoke Marathi and the women wore saris. While they observed Jewish dietary law, they were often vegetarians like many of their Hindu neighbours. A newer Indian Jewish community hailed from Iraq and was known as the Baghdadis. The Baghdadis were lighter skinned, they spoke Arabic, and they dressed in Arabian clothing. By the beginning of the 1930s, Rangoon was one of 4 cities in India with a sizable Jewish population. The central synagogue in Rangoon was constructed in the last decade of the 19th century by the Sassoons, a wealthy and famous Baghdadi family. The synagogue was named Musmiah Yeshua, which means in Hebrew, sprouting of salvation. The Musmiah Yeshua synagogue was controlled by the Baghdadis, who were the largest ethnic group of Jews in Rangoon. In the 1920s, members of the small B'nai Israel community in Rangoon participated in the election of the trustees of the synagogue, but they were not permitted to stand for office. In the lead up to the 1934 elections, the outgoing trustees not only refused to list the candidacy of the B'nai Israel, they also denied them voting rights on the grounds that they did not observe Jewish law. There was a long history of tension between the Baghdadis and the B'nai Israel, and this is not the place to recount that story. Suffice it to say that the Baghdadi Jews consistently questioned whether the B'nai Israel Jews were real Jews. What makes the Musmiah Yeshua case stand out is that it reached the Rangoon courts, when individuals from the B'nai Israel community instituted legal proceedings against the outgoing trustees of the synagogue. According to the synagogue bylaws, eligibility was limited to males of the Jewish faith and community. The B'nai Israel plaintiffs argued that they fulfilled that requirement, while the Baghdadi defendants countered that the B'nai Israel could not be considered of the Jewish faith and community because they did not adhere to Jewish divorce law. In his ruling, Judge Leach detailed the specifics of the discrimination. Since 1926, B'nai Israel Jews had been allowed to publicly read the Torah once they had given a written undertaking to follow Jewish law. The trustees told the court that they were willing to grant B'nai Israel voting rights if they would give a similar undertaking in writing. However, the B'nai Israel were unwilling to be subject to such a condition, as they saw this as casting aspersions on their Jewish identity. The Rangoon High Court had already been critical of a decision handed down by a lower court that applied principles of English law to an alimony case between 2 Jews. The case, therefore, needed to be decided based on Jewish law. Indeed, it was not uncommon in India for British judges to decide points of religious law, whether it was Hindu, Islam, Armenian Christian, or Parsi religious law. But supplementary information was necessary for the Rangoon court to determine this question of Jewish law. The court therefore sought expert opinions in an attempt to ascertain the identity of the Bnei Israel. For details of Jewish law, the court needed experts in Jewish law. The court report does not preserve the identity of these additional sources of information. Fortunately, archival material fills the gap and reveals that the parties solicited expert opinions from rabbinical authorities in Iraq, Palestine, and London. Turning to rabbinical authorities in Baghdad is unsurprising. Rangoon Jews of Iraqi extract naturally turned to rabbinical authorities in their state of origin. Turning to rabbinical authorities in Palestine, the mythical centre of Judaism and the historic seat of Jewish law, is also unsurprising, particularly considering that the British had established the chief rabbinate in Jerusalem in 1921. Turning to the British rabbinate, however, is less predictable. British rabbis had no official jurisdiction over Rangoon, not according to British law, nor according to Jewish law. From London came two opinions. Chief Rabbi Hertz sided with the Baghdadi Jews. Bnei Israel should be accorded voting rights if they promised to observe Jewish law. Alas, the office of the chief rabbi was not universally accepted in London. Thus, Moses Gaster was also asked for an opinion, and he disagreed with Hertz's opinion. Bnei Israel were full-fledged Jews, and their status was not conditional on producing a written undertaking of fidelity to Jewish law. The court adopted Gaster's opinion and ruled that Bnei Israel Jews had the right to vote and could be elected trustees of the synagogue. The British colonial legal structure provided for the possibility of sending questions of law from colonies to the Privy Council in London. In this case, both the parties and the court mimicked that legal structure in deciding a question of Jewish law by turning to London rabbis. Did Jewish communities in other British colonies also turn to London with their questions in Jewish law? More importantly, what happens as colonial rule wanes? To address this scenario, let us now turn to colonial Australia. Jews arrived in Australia as convicts in 1788, but a Jewish community was established only in the 19th century, and then it was faced with a question of religious import: when to pray for rain in the southern hemisphere. For today's purposes, we don't need to detail the structure and the vicissitudes of when Jews ask for rain. Suffice it to say that the prayer is seasonal. Jews ask for rain in winter, not in summer. Upon reaching the southern hemisphere, the question arose: when should Jews ask for rain? Should they follow the local seasons, or should they ask for rain at the same time as their northern hemisphere counterparts? The question, of course, was not unique to Australia. Each area with its unique climate and agricultural needs could ask a similar question, and in fact, the issue had been discussed in different forms with different outcomes in Babylon, Germany, Provence, Spain, and in modern times, Central and South America. When the question arose in Australia, there was already much precedent to draw upon, yet none of the precedents were cited. In the present context, I'm less interested in the proposed norms or the common practice. Rather, I'm interested in how new communities tackled the issue. Where did communal leaders turn for a ruling? The first reported ruling on the rain issue dates back to the first half of the 19th century, when the question was addressed to Solomon Herschel, widely hailed as the first chief rabbi of the British Empire. From London, Herschel instructed Australian juries never to pray for rain, not during the southern hemisphere winter, so as not to break with the practice of world Jewry, and not during the southern hemisphere summer, when local rain might harm agriculture. In 1846, a few years after Herschel's death, the Jews of Hobart turned to London with a similar question, and in 1848 the same question came from the Melbourne Jewish community. Herschel's successor issued the same ruling as his predecessor. It should come as no surprise that fledgling Australian Jewish communities turned to London. Not only were they mimicking the structures of the local legal systems, the Jews were generally of British descent. Unlike their Burmese counterparts, it was natural for Australian Jewry to address their questions to the chief rabbinate in London. With time, however, the makeup of the Australian Jewish community evolved. No longer were the communities made up of expatriate Brits. Australia's generous immigration policy also brought Jews from Eastern Europe, and their allegiance was not necessarily to the British Crown. In 1863, a dispute broke out in Melbourne regarding the prayer for rain. A Melbourne resident sent a letter to Eliyahu Guttmacher in Prussia. Guttmacher records that it was local Melbourne Jews of Polish extract who wanted to bring the practice in line with Northern Hemisphere norms, and they sought his support for the change. The end of Guttmacher's responsum is missing, but it appears that even though he was in favour of changing the practice, he deferred to the ruling of the British chief rabbis. Some 30 years later, Abraham Eber Hershowitz arrived in Melbourne. Hershowitz learned of the local custom never to pray for rain, and he believed that their approach was mistaken. He embarked upon a campaign to change the local practice. His strategy was to seek support for his position from rabbinic authorities around the world, and to this end, he conducted lengthy correspondence with rabbinic authorities in Lithuania and Palestine, and to a lesser extent, London. Hershowitz's correspondence continued unabated for 3 years until August 1894, when he set sail for America. Despite his unflagging efforts, success did not rain down on Hershowitz. His efforts were thwarted by loyalty to England. Yet over time, Jewish communities adopted the Northern Hemisphere practice, contrary to the ruling of the chief rabbis of England. Two factors can be identified: the evolving makeup of the Australian Jewish communities and the development of a uniquely Australian identity that was no longer linked to Britain. Without this link, Jews of Australia were not culturally bound to London. These two case studies invite further research. Let me conclude by noting two pertinent questions and my preliminary thoughts on these issues. First, do the Rangoon synagogue case and the Melbourne rain case reflect norms of Jewish communities in the British colonies, or are they idiosyncratic affairs that should not be considered representative of broader trends? At this stage, my working hypothesis is that these fascinating interactions coming from two very different types of British colonies, a settler colony and a non-settler colony, may indeed indicate a broader phenomenon. To buttress this contention, I hope to identify further cases from Jewish communities in British colonies around the world. Second, assuming that these cases are reflective of broader trends, why did Jewish communities in the British colonies turn to London? There's three possible explanations for turning to London with questions in Jewish law, even though there was no formal or legal links tying the Jewish communities in the colonies to the chief rabbinate in London. First, from the perspective of epistolary networks, it was far easier to send a letter from a British colony to London than to Eastern Europe or to Palestine. Accessibility of the decisor has always been, and indeed in the internet age continues to be, a factor in seeking a judgment in law generally and particularly in Jewish law. Second, a centre-periphery spatial metaphor may clarify the relationships I've described. The centre may be the state of origin, as in the Australian rain discussions. Immigrants perceive their previous communities as their centre, with their new homes and fledgling communities taken as a periphery. Alternatively, questions were addressed to a mythical centre, the land of Israel, or more specifically, Jerusalem. In the Burma case, parties consulted their state of origin, Baghdadi Jews sought opinions from Iraqi rabbis, as well as their mythical centre, parties sought opinions from Jewish jurists in the land of Israel. It would seem, however, that this metaphor alone is insufficient in explaining how London became a centre for Baghdadis and for B'nai Israel. This brings me to the third possibility that draws on mimetic theory. Franco-American polymath René Girard argued that imitation is the fundamental mechanism for human behaviour. He described how all desire is based on the conduct of other human beings. That desire precipitates pre-conscious imitation. It can be said that the colonial Jewish communities displayed a mimetic desire to replicate the British legal regime in the colonies, where questions of law were decided by a supreme legal body sitting in England that assumed to be better equipped, more qualified, and with a broader perspective to rule on the most difficult cases. Girard first used mimetic theory as a tool of literary analysis before applying the theory to the social sciences. The theory has since been used in empirical fields such as psychology and neuroscience. I'm suggesting that the theory may also be applicable to the realm of law and the study of legal transfers. Undoubtedly, all three factors and perhaps others played a role, and at this stage of my research, it's unclear which factor was the major catalyst. But I look forward to filling out the legal portrait of Jewish communities in the British colonies in my future research. Thank you.